Though times it seems like I'm coming undone.
Chapter 25 deals with the Sabbath year and the super-sabbath, the year of Jubilee, which comes every 50 years. The observance of the super-sabbath and the Sabbath year focuses primarily on regulating the land and the people, but it has a religious connotation. Remember, the land on which Moses and his people were returning was land promised to Abraham and his lineage by God. These were the seeds of Abraham that were returning. And so God said to Moses, "When you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath year." In essence, the land must rest. The land must lie fallow for the seventh year. Crops could not be grown, and those crops which were permanent, like grapes and olives, were not to be cared for. Annual crops like grain would often reseed themselves, and therefore they would have some growth in the field, and the perennial crops would continue to grow and bear fruit. You just didn't take care of them. Harvesting for sale was not allowed during the Sabbath year or the Jubilee year. They did not prohibit the people from eating the crops. The people and livestock, especially the poor, could eat from the field. But this was a test of faith. Faith was required for Israel to follow these Sabbath year instructions. Letting the fields lie fallow seemed like a waste. In fact, it put Israel in the position of trusting God for their daily bread, and a land with weak people could easily be taken over by the enemies that surrounded Israel. The super-sabbath or Jubilee was similar to, but not identical to, the Sabbath year. The year of Jubilee commenced with the sounding of a ram's horn on the annual Day of Atonement, which was the 10th day of the 7th month. Since the year of Jubilee was the 50th year, following the heels of the seventh year, or the 49th year, it would seem that the land would then lay fallow for 2 years. God is able to provide 1 or 2 years. On the Sabbath year, all the debts were canceled, but the Jubilee year went a little further. For all the Israelites who had sold themselves to another were released. The land which had been leased to another is now restored to its original owner or family. Only houses which were in the walled city were exempt from this regulation, and after a redemption period of 1 year, it became the permanent possession of the purchaser. So why did Israel have an observance which was in essence an economic regulation? Well, we study economics because man has unlimited wants and desires and limited resources. Sabbath and super-sabbath are faith-based observances which impact the economy and try to bring back equity. The Sabbath and super-sabbath were a reminder first to Israel that God owned the land. God clearly stated that the land that they were going back to possess was land that he gave them, that Israel was just a tenant. These practices of canceling debt and giving back land made it possible for most Israelites to become recipients of God's divine blessing. A large part of God's blessings to Israel were his promises that he would bring them rain and they would be able to grow crops. But you needed land in order to benefit from these promises. Jubilee allowed for a periodic redistribution of wealth back to the poor. This observance of the Sabbath and Jubilee years also was a test of Israel's faith. If they were going to be obedient, they would be back in a situation of depending on God for daily substance. The entire nation was in a similar footing as they all sought God for their food. Since debts were canceled, Jubilee year provided the poor with food and the possibility of new beginnings. These regulations discouraged our natural tendency for materialism and greed, and it kept a check on those who would try to accumulate vast holdings at the expense of others. There would be little incentive for one to lease the land of another, since that land would ultimately have to be returned to the original owner. The law of Jubilee was Israel's way of making sure that the concepts of social justice were a part of their national discourse and their national character. American social mobility has declined over the past decades. Median wages have stagnated. The gap between the richest Americans and the poorest Americans has grown year after year. This generation of young people is the first generation in modern history expected to be poorer than their parents. Inequity and injustice are not Christian values. Our walk must reflect justice and fairness in our dealings with others. That is what God expects of us. Remember Micah, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love with kindness, and to humbly walk with God? That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week. Bye.